Talking with Jerry.
Okay, good evening. Good evening. So we're going to talk this evening briefly about DJ Academics, some comments he made. It's been over a month now, and I waited to reply for a reason because I wanted to let other people get things that they wanted to mention out of the way. So joining me is Casual Cal. Also, Casual Cal, most people don't know. I'll be talking about this in a longer episode about how hip hop began. Cal, some people know him from the Universal Soul Circus, but Cal was the first MC for the Fresh Fest tour, which was the first national rap tour. So, Cal, without further ado, let's just have this little discussion.
Hey, Jerry, I was reading about and hearing about what you were saying about academic, and he's so out of pocket. But reading and hearing what you're talking about, and after you've seen the forecast of rap coming, have you ever been approached to manage a group or a person? And if yes, who? And if no, why not?
Yeah, well, in the early days of hip hop, and that's I want to just give a little bit of background on myself before I go into his comments. I was on the forefront of trying to get artists record deals, and I'm going to get into that. So I was managing certain artists. You may remember True Love, who was on Atlantic that we got. He was one of the first rappers on Atlantic Records. He was actually the second one. And there were several others that I work with. But to kind of backtrack here, DJ Academic's comments were at the end of one of his broadcasts about rappers, old school rappers look dusty. So that's basically what I wanted to address and why that is. I mean, if someone's looking at certain people who were the pioneers of hip hop, other than the LL, who really has had that, 30 plus year career, these guys that were out there many years ago, they didn't have the opportunities to make money that the artists are making now today with the live concert appearances at festivals, with the streaming revenue. I just read that Drake had like 100 million streams, he just released this new single. So I wanted to briefly, talk about the early days so people have an understanding of why those rappers are in the position that they are, and they aren't dusty, but what it was like in those early days. So as far as me, that question, Cal, that you asked, I was the first one to take DJ Hollywood out of the Bronx, the man who created the term hip hop, and brought him into Manhattan at the Hotel Diplomat, where we had people from other boroughs get exposed to what was the beginning of hip hop music, because people wouldn't come from Brooklyn, they wouldn't come from Queens to go into the Bronx because it really wasn't safe for them. But doing DJ Hollywood in Manhattan at the Hotel Diplomat on 43rd Street in the center of Manhattan, people were able to come from all over. I also gave the biggest hip-hop party, so to speak, one of the first big ones, at Bonds International, which I ran every Friday in New York City, where I was one of the biggest club promoters. And when I brought in Africa Bambaataa and the Soul Sonic Force, which was their first appearance, we actually closed down Times Square. We had so many people come to Bonds that night that it was almost like a New Year's Eve, believe it or not.
But Jerry, you was head of the game, man. There was no radio play for these artists. I mean, how was you getting people to your show?
Right. Well, that's something I'm going to talk about. Luckily, my relationship with Frankie Crocker, who was the man that made the decisions about what records got played. But that party at Bonds, they broke into the news. I mean, the news broke into all of the local programming on Channel 2, 4, and 7 to tell people don't go down to the Times Square area. Trains are not stopping at 42nd or 34th Street. And they had to call the borough commander for Manhattan, and they called police from every precinct in Manhattan to restore order in Times Square because I had that many people there. In addition to
Wow.
that, I did the first, what you would say, quote, rap concert, which was at City College, long before P. Diddy did his show there, which was almost a decade later. This was in 1978, and we sold out 5,000 tickets a week in advance. So that's just some of my background, and then trailing into what you were saying as far as the artist management. I worked with Classical 2, which was one of the first on RCA. I think it was through Zamba, which was produced by Teddy Riley, who I worked with since he, kind of was first starting out. True Love, I mentioned, was on Atlantic, King Sunday Moet, quite a few. But to give people an understanding in DJ Academics, and there's some things you may know, you may not know. In that era, artists probably got a budget of $10,000 to do an album. Maybe they got $3, $4 to $5,000 for themselves. Nobody got royalties. And Cal, from the Fresh Fest, which was the first national rap tour, those groups, everyone from Run DMC, Houdini, the Fat Boys, they were getting, maybe Ricky was paying them maybe $2, $3, $4, $5,000. They had to split that amongst themselves. That was not a lot of money, even though in that era it was a decent amount of money. But you can't live the rest of your life off of that. And even when things began to get better, the money was still not a lot album budget wise. And you remember that the first albums were basically all done by independent labels. The major labels had no interest in rap music. I had an artist on Motown. I remember going to LA, sitting at Motown's offices with their A&R people, etc., and playing True Love's record, which was the first rap slow record for the executives. And one of the A&R people walked over to the cassette deck, because that's what we used to use then, cassettes, and stopped it and took the cassette out and gave it back to me and said, "We're not interested in this." And I said to them, you're Motown. You're supposed to be the sound of young America. This is the future. Not the Temptations and the Four Tops and the Supremes. No disrespect, but those acts were approaching being near 50 years old. And though I wasn't in the meeting with Berry Gordy, Berry wasn't there. All his top people were, and they basically blew me off.
So Jerry,
right?
So that brings me to this: how do we have young people, you being a librarian and an ex-teacher, to start doing more research instead of jumping on everything they see on social media?
Well, I was talking to someone about that earlier today, and they were telling me that a young person that they communicate with all the time, that's helping them with a project, he feels unfortunate, and he works with a lot of hip-hop artists, that young people in general don't read a lot because they have their phones and they can Google something. They're pulling off a short paragraph or something, and they don't know the backstory. And as you know, that's one of the things I'm doing with my podcast, is creating the backstory to so many of these issues. And as I was mentioning, I tell you about Motown. I'll tell you about two other quick stories. And DJ Academics, these are two stories that you wouldn't know because they're my personal stories, and I haven't shared them other than with friends. But Casablanca Records at one point was the hottest record label that there was. They had the Village People, they had Cher, they had Parliament Funkadelic, they had Kiss, they had Cameo, Donna Summer. It was the hottest label. And I knew one of the executives there, or my brother knew because he grew up with it, my older brother, and he was the vice president of the label. I go out to LA, I want to talk to them about rap music. They had kind of heard, through the underground, and Sylvia Robinson, of course, who put out Sugar Hill Gang. They knew those people. And I can remember saying to them about what the future was, and them saying to me, "We can't make any money off this because we use 12 inches, which was a 12-inch disc, if people don't know the size of an album, but it was just one song playing all over and over again. We don't make money off that. We use that for promotion. The only way we could really make money is an album. And who in the world would ever buy an album full of rap music? So, that's what it was like in that era. And just another story to share. James Mtume, the great jazz musician, and also, as you know, transitioned to doing contemporary group music with the group Mtume, and his song "Juicy Fruit" Biggie used, which became one of the biggest rap songs ever, especially for Biggie. James, when he was in the group Mtume and producing Stephanie Mills, they were producing Phyllis Hyman, so many great R&B acts besides themselves. I knew the drummer in that group, and I got a meeting with James, told him that I had some rap artists, and could he assist or we do a production deal to put their music on wax instead of cassette tapes and take it to some of the labels. James set up some meetings with me and his manager. We ended up going to Atlantic Records. We had a meeting with CBS Records, but no interest. Even though Mtume, who was a hot producer at the time, was going to produce the record, the major labels had no interest. So it was a very difficult time, and I say this so that people get an understanding of, in the early days of rap, how difficult it was. It was just these small labels. The majors had no interest. And now I want to go into the next thing, which, Cal, you mentioned, the DJs and radio. Rap music was not played, you know this, around the rest of the country in the beginning. It was only played in New York. And Frankie Crocker, who I knew, I would just kind of say I was his bag man, because Frankie had got in trouble for payola. And then what he did in the future was he would get groups from the record labels, and he didn't have to pay for the groups. And we would do a deal where I would get Jeffrey Osborne or Stacey Lattisaw, all of these groups, and present them at the events I was doing. And Frankie would come down, and I would give him a couple of $1,000s for getting me the group for free. So I had that relationship with Frankie, and he didn't like rap music at all. Frankie did not like rap music. But eventually he started a show with Mr. Magic's Rap Attack, and for 1 hour a night on Saturdays from 11 to 12, Frankie let Mr. Magic play all the rap music that he wanted. And that was New York City, and that's all that was allowed. So once again, to the audience and to DJ Academics, I don't know if you know that part of the history of the beginning of the music, but I just wanted to lay out how difficult it was in the beginning. And I wanted to address, in general, for just people who look at some of the early pioneers of rap, and then they go and say, oh, well, these guys, they really aren't people who made money off of rap. They aren't wealthy. But the truth of the matter is that when other people came to America and became the biggest rock stars in the history of rock music, they learned their craft by listening to Bo Diddley, Little Richard, B.B. King. So the Beatles, Mick Jagger, Eric Clapton, all of those guys, when they came to America, they didn't look down at Little Richard and said, oh, you don't have any money, you don't have a Rolls Royce, you're struggling. They didn't look at Bo Diddley, who was getting older and didn't probably have very much. And those guys didn't own their publishing back in those days. Those rock artists came and paid homage to those guys. They admired them. And more importantly, they knew that without those black pioneers that they listened to create what will become rock and roll music, which was the biggest music of the 70s and 80s and 90s, they would have never made it without that impetus of those guys. So they didn't diss the old school black pioneers of what these white artists created rock and roll. And I think that's the compare and contrast as an educator that I'm trying to throw out here, Cal, to the audience.
And as quiet as it's kept, the rock and roll guys love rap music.
Oh yeah, because
They didn't
rap.
have no control of it, but they loved it. They supported it, you know.
Yeah, a lot of the early rock and roll guys. I mean, you might remember Chuck D from Public Enemy, and I
Mm-hmm.
remember reading in his book he talked about when they were on tour with I'm trying to remember the name of the rock band from Ireland. Uh, I cannot think of the name. They're one of the Irish band, but it just escapes me right now. But he talked
Mm-hmm.
about when he went on tour with them, they loved rap music, and how on one of the tour dates after the show, they were getting on their bus. They had a long ride to go to the next state. I think it was from Texas. They were maybe going to Southern California, and
Mm-hmm.
they came to him and said, "What? You guys are riding the bus? No, you got to travel with us. Hop on the plane." And really making them feel that they were a big part of this tour now, and saying, "Hey,
Mm-hmm.
we know you guys can't afford to fly from city to city, but guess what? We have our own large jet that we're going from city to city. Get on the plane with us." So that's one of many stories of rock and roll artists who this in the early days of rap, when they were getting exposed to it, how they treated some of the rappers back in that era. So
Well, pretty soon, man, you got to talk about how did you feel about these rappers hitting the national market and playing big venues, with the original New York City Fresh Festival,
oh yeah,
and how that impacted everything from there. And all them years they toured, Jerry, and never nominated for Grammy, wasn't even accepted by Grammys,
right,
none of that stuff.
yes,
So there's a lot of stuff to still be discussed on this topic.
oh yeah, because the other piece I didn't mention to the audience and to DJ academics and those who want to know a little bit about the beginnings of the music that's not in articles and not in books, there was no way that rap music, even when the major labels started signing the artists and they wanted to make a little money out of it, was going to cross over. Because at that time period, music was segmented, and all the black groups were at the black music department in the label. And the label
Mm-hmm.
did not allocate money to cross them over to go to pop radio. So you could be the biggest black artist, but you were condemned, so to speak, to be on black radio, on the black charts with a black audience. That they weren't going to spend any money to cross you over. You had a few people like Prince crossed over a little, and of course we know the biggest artist who did it at that era was Michael Jackson. And
Mm-hmm.
once Michael Jackson did cross over and become a pop artist, they took Michael Jackson away from the black music department and put him in the pop department, even though he was a black artist. And it was basically a lot of white promotion people, etc., at the label who were handling Michael's career. But they were not going to take those resources, even though these rap artists were starting to make noise, and crossed them over on what was then white radio or rock radio or contemporary music radio. They were not going to promote them that way. So rap artists, there was no white audience that was hearing your music. You were promulgated to just black radio. And if some white kids listened to black radio, they would discover you. Or if back then, of course, people went to record stores. So it was a whole different era. And obviously, younger people don't know nothing about that era. And I just wanted to do this commentary tonight and then close with just this one compare and contrast. And that is, and then address the DJ academics again, and to any younger person to understand what was happening and why things were the way they were 30 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever. Imagine going to, let's say, Jamaica, right? And you fall in love with reggae music. And you discover Peter Tosh, and you discover, the Wailers, and all of these great, reggae artists who existed in popularity 25, 30 years ago. You wouldn't go to Jamaica and start to call them names or say, well, their careers aren't as big as so and so and so and so. Because at the same time, you have to put it in context as to where they were. And that's why I gave the example about the artists coming from Europe. When they came to America, they think the black artists who they listened to when they were young kids, which inspired them to make rock and roll music. And of course, we know people like Mick Jagger, the Beatles. I mean, I did a show and worked with Paul McCartney. I'm going to tell that story. And, Paul McCartney is really Sir Paul McCartney. And he was a billionaire, a real billionaire, before a lot of these other artists today who, say that they're billionaires. I'm talking about he was a billionaire some time ago. So that's what I wanted to share with this particular podcast. And just as I said, tell some backstories that I do with every podcast that I do, and do a compare and contrast so people can learn something that you didn't know. And I just want to let you be aware that there are two podcasts coming up that you're definitely going to want to listen to. One is the true story of how hip hop began before it was on vinyl. And that's a whole story of what was taking place to create this industry, this music that dominates the world today. And the other, as I mentioned, is with Casual Cow, who is on the line, who was the first MC of the first rap tour ever, the Fresh Fest. And he's going to talk about what that was like, taking rap music around the country to cities where people kind of had heard about what was happening in New York, but now they had a chance to go to a concert venue and see all of these New York rappers on stage, along with great dancers and other people. And one of the dancers, who was just a hip hop dancer at those concerts on the Fresh Fest tour, was little Jermaine Dupri, who went on to be a great producer. But Cal, I don't want to talk anymore because that's your story and we will cover it. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. Please click on the link to subscribe. Please like, and I will be bringing you great stories that you never heard before. That's a guarantee. Thank you.